Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back with more Best Ball Mania content for you today. I'm excited to have Erik Beimfohr on the podcast. Erik joined me last year on the podcast, and we tried to big brain some stuff talking about Best Ball Mania 2, and I'm excited to review what happened a little bit in terms of some of the ideas that we had and where we might have gone wrong, where we might have gone right, and how we're going to adjust that to this year's contest, which is a little bit different. Make sure you check out Establish the Edge on the iTunes podcast. You can also find it on YouTube at the Establish the Run channel. And Erik, you can find his work over at spikeweek.com. Erik does everything best ball, including very impressive 100% advance rate in the NHL best ball streets. Thanks for hopping on, Erik.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I was thinking about this morning, that episode that we did last year, and like trying to think back to some of the conversation, and it's just so crazy how far this space has come in 12 months or whatever. Not even, I don't even remember exactly when we recorded that, but it is wild. I mean, I think last year we thought, crowning 2 millionaires total across all of best ball was pretty crazy, and now one tournament is going to have 3 of them. one individual tournament is going to have 3 millionaires. So with that being said, I think there's, like you said, it's very different this year, which is like really important. That's maybe one of my biggest takeaways that we'll get into later, is how different this year is than last year. And then really just assessing what our opponents are doing, which we talked quite a bit about also last year, structurally, player takes, all that kind of stuff, and like being more cognizant of the natural like we all make mistakes. I have biases, and just like everybody else does. And at the top of what I'm sure we're going to get into is one that I had last year that failed about as spectacularly as you can possibly fail, but trying to learn from all that for this year.
Yeah, and even though it is a different contest, I think like on a high level, how we're approaching the tournaments carries over, and then we can get into some of the nuances of how it does change going, to such, the finals, like triple the size basically of last year, which is a big deal. The one you're referencing, the mistake we made last year, we were very heavy on the rookie quarterbacks, particularly Trey Lance, and man, on one end, I'm looking at my teams, and I did have a pretty good advance rate on my teams despite this. So there's part of me that goes, if it would have worked, things would have gone really well. There's a part of me that with the rookie quarterbacks, I think there was a point at which, I mean, the hot dog costume guy, like, we're looking for who did this. The ADPs got so crazy on Trey Lance, and I wouldn't say so crazy, but they got much more efficient over the summer. And I, instead of being like, okay, I should stop drafting Trey Lance now, I was like, well, I just got to draft him earlier. And for me, that was kind of where the mistake was, where at the quarterback position, I do think it's hard to find guys that have legitimate, top 8 upside that can, beat out some of these solidified names and that are being drafted outside the top 15 quarterbacks. So I do think taking swings on guys that potentially fit that mold makes a ton of sense. But then when you start drafting, someone whose playing time is uncertain as QB 11 off the board, the risk reward, just it probably didn't add up. Just got a little take locked on Lance for myself, at least.
I think that's the lesson, is we don't want to draft Trey Lance. I actually don't have like any regrets at all about like making him a target and even like a priority for portions of the summer, because of exactly what you said. I mean, shoot, even like in the back end of the top 10, the quarterbacks that we're drafting, like you just can't find that up. It goes away so fast at the quarterback position now. To me, it's by far the most efficient, like a most efficiently drafted area of the market now, is like we're just so good at the quarterback thing, right? And it's so much more projectable, like, because you can project a quarterback. You're basically projecting an offense, like almost like, how good is this offense going to be? We have lots of data on how good the offense is going to be, whether it be, just the last handful of years with the Chiefs and stuff for many years with coaches, and then obviously those individual players. And it's just so much easier to project. And then you obviously have the rushing thing, which adds the ceiling element for a lot of these guys. And so it's just so efficient that when you get, because of him being a rookie, because of uncertainty or whatever, you get Trey Lance, Justin Fields, even the other rookies like you mentioned, Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, guys that, like, I don't know what the actual range, what the real probabilities were on, them being top 5 quarterbacks, but it was in the range, and that's just what we get with the uncertainty. Trey Lance, especially. However, to your point, that's good. Like, I want to still target those guys, and I'm going to do it again this year and next year and so on. I want to find Josh Allen before he's the QB1. I want to find Lamar Jackson before he's an MVP. But there is, like you said, I mean, Lance was like early 7th round, like sometimes like late 6th round, going, ahead of like Dak Prescott and Russell Wilson. And it got pretty out of control. And so that is the lesson, I think, is we can take a step back and pump the brakes once we reach a certain point where it's probably the like you said, the risk outweighs the reward.
But as of right now, we can martingale Trey Lance.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
His ADP is lower than it was last season. And we have, well, I've got more QB stuff later. I don't want to get too far into it, but we do have the market kind of at ETR at least overvaluing a lot of the mid-tier quarterbacks, and the one that we have them not overvaluing is Trey Lance. So
I know, it's crazy.
We'll be back. As far as more structural stuff, we hit on a few things in the podcast last year. One of which was when you were drafting your teams. I remember you were distinctly committed to going half early and half late. And in general, I think you and I both have a mindset of the mantra of loose convictions, like tight or strong convictions loosely held.
Yep.
And you I like the way that you committed to doing that strategy, because I think you learn from it better and you eke out the potential reward better, even if you don't believe in it to the extent that you're sort of experimenting with. And so I am curious as to how you felt that worked out for you, and if you're adjusting that for this year.
Yeah, that's always a hot button issue. People love the when do you draft thing. And to your point, I think the biggest thing was, like you said, committing to something. Almost, it's an experiment essentially, right? And we only get to do this thing once a year. And so one summer you get to do one like draft strategy, not from a structural perspective, but from when to draft. So could you commit to all late for that summer, kind of see how it goes, not even just from a results perspective. And that was the big thing for me, was I learned so much about just the market. I think everybody did last year, particularly once we reached a certain crazy part of the off season with the wide receiver stuff. But learning how these markets shift, learning and then seeing it play out, right, with the Cam Akers thing, with the Michael Thomas stuff, and like we're not going to get all those elements every single summer, but being able to feel that out like in real time. And having drafted teams that were dead with Cam Akers, and then also having drafted 25% Darrell Henderson, and you're like, oh man, I have a lot of super teams, right? Other people, James Robinson or whatever. We thought it was Marquez Callaway for a minute, and then he got steamed worse than Trey Lance did. But going through that experience, I think, is important for everybody to kind of set out an experiment and do it. I know Herzig, Justin Herzig, your coworker, did like in one of the tournaments auto drafting, setting rankings and auto drafting. And I think he said he didn't really he won't do that again, but it was an experiment to see, okay, how are these teams going to turn out? And for me, from that experiment with the barbell thing, I probably feel stronger about it even than I did last year, because it's like this natural portfolio, like differentiator, like once that Cam Akers thing, that's an easy example. Like I said, we may not get that every year, but like that happened, and it's like, okay, I got my whatever Darrell Henderson, I wasn't going to draft him anymore. And I know we talk about that as a potential strategy type thing too, but like all these things play out over the course of the summer. Guys rise and fall, right? Why was I targeting Trey Lance in the first place, to our original example? Because he was going in like the 14th round when Best Ball Mania 2 opened last year. And then watching him go all the way up to the late 6th round, it's like, I should have probably realized that in real time that was a mistake. But you see it now after having gone through, 150 teams over 4 months. And so I also think the last thing is site by site, it's very different. I think Underdog, the market got so efficient already this year in Best Ball Mania 3, like a handful of days and all the sharks came in and like snatched up all the value really fast and made it pretty efficient versus maybe say some other sites where that's not the case. And then we also have other tournaments that are going to drop in the middle where you can kind of deploy different strategies, or maybe if there's a player you want to target in that, right? The puppy's out right now in Underdog. So figuring all that out like is hard, but I think you just kind of have to experience it for an entire summer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a long summer. I feel like Best Ball Mania 3 has been going on for a while now, and it's June 1st. We've
June
got
1st.
June, July. I mean, we've got 3 full months to go here, and that affects things differently than say the puppy on Underdog, which could fill in over a week. It did at times
Yep.
last year. For me, some of the takeaways I had, we went into last year, and you spoke to this about, okay, we got to know what our opponents are doing. And I think it was like the hyper fragile running back strategy we were talking about a lot going into it, that people might lean on that too much because of the previous year's data. And it was an interesting way it worked. It ended up spinning out is that the hyper fragile stuff worked fairly well, but not because of the huge quantity at wide receiver. And that was something we sort of saw coming, which is the wide receiver ADPs are all, at least on Underdog, getting pushed up. Your 10th wide receiver isn't as strong as it was the year prior. And we did see
No.
that with the advance rates, that 10 wide receiver teams really didn't do that well, despite hyperfragile doing well, even though those two strategies are somewhat correlated. I think it was different for other sites. Again, like FFPC, when I play on, I mean, you get wide receivers towards the end of those drafts, and part of that's because of the tight end premium stuff. But you get wide receivers, you're like, wow, I'm drafting like a starting wide receiver in round 15, and that's not happening on Underdog. So that wasn't really a mistake or anything I made. It's just kind of interesting that worked out how we thought it would play out.
Yeah.
For me, a mistake. I do like the draft as if you're right mindset, but I feel like I might have, and I'm glad I experimented with it, but I think I pushed it a little too far at times, especially at the onesie positions where, man, I'm a greedy drafter, Eric. I'm greedy with getting value on my stacks. I'm greedy with everything because I'm trying to build these super teams. And sometimes when you're doing that, it can be hard to find the edge of like, okay, when do you need to maybe just be a little bit more robust at the position just to make this team last a little longer, and maybe you aren't hurting your upside as much as possible. But I took some 2 QB teams that should have been 3 QB teams. Same thing with tight end, especially because I think the tight end and QB ADP, the other facet was because everybody was doing this, there were better values at the very end of draft where instead of taking that 10th wide receiver that was shitty now because everyone's drafting a ton of wide receivers and everyone wants to draft 2 at the onesie positions, it's like, oh, I can get a starting tight end in round 17. Maybe
Yep.
I should just do that.
Yeah, I love that point because I think it's you kind of mentioned like you just got a little too attached to like those hard and fast rules that we know like at a high level, like honestly, like probably ignoring everything you said about kind of the market with late round wide receivers, etc. Like probably 2-4-10-2 or like 2-6-8-2 is like somewhere between, and maybe a 2-5-9-2, whatever, somewhere in that little pocket there of structures is like where we want to live, right? We know the benefits of only spending 2 picks on those 2 onesie positions. We know the benefits, like you said, of a robust running back structure and making up for it through volume, etc. We know 0 running back, right? We know all of those things. But then you get to the ends of the actual drafts, particularly after the market has really kind of like soaked up all the value, which happened last year, like crazy. My favorite example I always talk about referencing that is at wide receiver last year. So 2 years ago, actually. And I think we talked about this. Cole Beasley was the starting slot receiver for the Buffalo Bills, one of the best offenses in the NFL, and caught 100 balls or whatever it was, going in the 17th round. Cole Beasley actually himself didn't get like boosted up a ton, but everybody got moved up 3, 4, 5 rounds at wide receiver. So now last year, it was like you got to the 18th round, you wanted that 10th wide receiver. It was like the 4th wide receiver on the Jaguars that you're drafting. Like I specifically had like 15% Colin Johnson. Not even like intentionally. It was just
There's
you got
nothing
there's absolutely nothing left. And so knowing that is like so important. And so to your point, you can do a couple different things. You can push QB and or tight end down the road, knowing like, look, in the 17th round, I'm getting, I don't know, Austin Hooper or whatever is there in the 17th round, is going to get me points. I don't even know if my 17th round wide receiver is going to make the team. It's such a stark difference between the positions. And so just being fluid with that in drafts, right? Ideally, I would have me Kyler Murray and whatever, Trey Lance, like give me those guys and give me Travis Kelce or George Kittle or whatever. But if your 14th through 18th round picks are all guys that like may never even touch the field this year at the other positions, you're probably being a little too rigid around what you wanted to go in as structurally.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads us into, where maybe some of the analysis is lacking or not good. I've seen some stuff out there that I think a couple things. I think people kind of go in two different directions that can both be wrong at times in terms of analysis. One is being too rigid with what worked the year prior and not taking into account the player context. So we have a couple articles up on ETR, and one is sort of that rigid analysis. And we try to caveat it that like, hey, this is pretty rigid analysis. We think we can learn from this, but learning from it is different than mimicking it exactly without critical thought. And then Jack Miller did another piece for us that put it all of that in context of, okay, well, how did the players do? And the one last year was, early running backs did really well, and hitting wide receivers in the dead zone did really well. And some of those makes sense because like, oh yeah, somewhat hyper fragile and avoiding the running back dead zone. But a lot of it honestly just came down to the round 2 wide receivers stunk and the round 2 running backs went ham, and drafting 2 running backs early, and then the running back dead zone was like even worse than maybe we could have anticipated.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that worked. Of course that worked. And this year, I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. If anything, I kind of like flipping it. But so you need to acknowledge the context. I think that's one. And then I think there's people who are like, well, because of the context, they just kind of ignore it completely, and they get like these huge galaxy brain ideas that and a lot of the galaxy brain ideas do come down to the fact that the playoff weeks themselves are like the expected value in the playoffs is like 98% of your total expected value. And it's finding that balance between, okay, the playoffs in terms of leverage are like a million times more important than the regular season. But how predictable, like how much can we control that though? Just because we know that doesn't mean we can, force ourselves into necessarily having it. So you're trying to find that balance. So I rambled a little bit. I'll throw it over to you. Any takes on that stuff or analysis you've seen?
The playoff thing is so fascinating. And I think it's eventually, maybe if this thing like grows too big, I know Jeremy from Underdog actually mentioned they don't think they want to do anything larger from a field size tournament, which I think is probably good, because that like week 17 and playoff thing is like an incredible like thought experiment and an awesome like strategy element that I sure as shit don't have the answers. I'm trying to find them, and I'm trying to find different strategies around it that I think can work, but it's such a unique format and structure of a contest that, to your point, we know all the value is in almost all the values, even just in the final week. But there's 4 steps. Like if you even like include the draft, you have to be a decent enough drafter at the time when you're drafting, and then you got to win that league, and then you got to win a really, really, really good league of other league winners. Then you got to do that again just to reach this point. It's 0.1%. It's the top 0.1% teams making this final round. And so we know all the value is there, but 99.9% of your teams have no shot of making
Right.
that final round. So how do you balance those things? And like I said, I don't have the answers, but I think that's the most fun part. And to your point about kind of some of the rigid analysis, I generally land a lot more times on the like pushing back on that, solely not because I don't think it's good or we should look at it, but solely because I think our space gets really too and I see it all the time. Like, I'm in Discords. We have a Discord at Spike Week, and I see someone, Jack, Hayden, right, TJ Hernandez, all these smart people out there doing this analysis will post this stuff, and someone will say, look, got to draft a running back in the second round.
Yeah.
And it's like, to your point, let's take a step back and like think about what this data is really meaning. And sometimes it does mean like maybe we should stay away from whatever something because of the historical data. And sometimes it's just describing how last year went, and we should try to apply that to this year's drafts. And I totally agree. I think this year's very different from last year. And we did an exercise. Silas Jackson, who writes for us, wrote an article about like reverse engineering what would have been like the perfect team last year, specifically for Best Ball Mania. So it's not just not 100% maximizing regular season points, and it's not just maximizing week 17, but finding that hybrid. And so there was just some interesting takeaways, like to your point, well, Austin Eckler and Jonathan Taylor crushed. And so did Devontae Adams, and their ADPs fell in line perfectly together last year. Whether it be almost any point, you could have taken Eckler, JT, Devontae, JT, whatever, that kind of combination. Cooper Kupp was there in the third round. Jamar Chase was there in the fourth round. Mark Andrews was there in the fifth, or Josh Allen in the fifth. So it was like everything just fell together perfectly for that. So naturally, in the data, that's what we see. We see there's a couple of players that drove all of that, right? You want an early tight end. Why? Because Mark Andrews blew away the field in the fifth, sixth round. And so, but how do we take that and apply it to this year and this player pool? And I think that's the most fun part, and obviously the most helpful part too.
Yeah. And also the analysis, I think like you need to compare to the field. I kind of felt bad. Hayden had a tweet that was kind of innocent. I think a bunch of people responded back to him, and then I did a couple days later. But it was basically that in the Best Ball Mania 2, the finalists, it was something like 80% of them drafted a running back in rounds 1 or 2. But then when you compared it to the field overall drafted running back like 84% of the time in rounds 1 or 2. So it was essentially like completely neutral. Like, this is what we should expect to see. Dude, there was another one with game stacking too, where it was like, well, actually, if you look at just random distribution of players, you're going to end up with like X% of game stacks. So you definitely want to do that comparison. And speaking of the game stacks, I mean, looking at this year's tournament, a few things to address. Again, triple the field size in the final. Super top heavy. We've also got a grand prize that's regular season. That is, initially I kind of was like, oh, happy accident if that happens. But you start thinking more, it's like, well, that's 10% of the prize pool. And yeah, even though that seems like a lottery, well, winning the playoffs is a lottery too.
Yeah, right.
So there's all these different things. As far as game stacking uniqueness, things that you can do that you think increase the edge of this tournament because of the way it's structured, like anything that sticks out to you that you're trying right now?
Yeah, the thing that people probably get sick of me talking about every time I do a show or anything is that week 17. And I think coming from the DFS background, I think, you and ETR people and like kind of where we come from, it just is a natural fit where, okay, we just talked about how we identified that like all the expected value is in this week. All the money is in this week. It's very top heavy, and all these teams are going to be really freaking good, right? So it's like showing up to the Thunderdome on DraftKings, except it's huge, but it's all the best player, like it's all the best DFS players on the planet. So you have no edge, right? Like from a skill perspective, you have no edge, and you need to finish, in the top 3% of the top 0.01% just to make any money. It's like dumbfounding to start to think about how hard it is. And so, like, what are some of the levers that we try to pull from a DFS perspective every week, right? You have like projection, you obviously have leverage from an ownership and stuff. Well, I can't really leverage any ownership because I don't know. It's that, like you said, we have 3 more months to draft, nonetheless, get to week 17
Yeah.
in the regular season. So some of those things, and even from a projection perspective, I can kind of pull a little bit of projection just from a high level. But again, for week 17, I don't know. Rashad Penny projected better than most first round running backs did by the time we got to week 17 last year. So again, it's not necessarily something I can pull, but what I can pull in every single draft is a correlation lever, right? I know I can inherently correlate week 17 in every single draft that I want to do. That doesn't mean I'm only going after Bills, Bengals, or whatever, right? The sexy games. I can correlate the gross games too. You know, people probably thought Seattle and Detroit was really gross, and that was the absolute league winner game. There was 80 or 70 points, 80 points, whatever, a million points in that game, and 2 of the biggest league winners, and even in DFS that week, stacks of that game won, despite Jamar Chase having 7 million fantasy points. So that's been my big thing is when I'm deciding, like, as I build out my team, right? I'm not going into it with I'm going to stack this game, but like, okay, first round I get Justin Jefferson, and I keep moving on down, and then it's maybe it's the second round, and I'll choose Aaron Jones over Leonard Fournette because they play in week 17, or I keep on moving down, right? Moving down. It's the 11th round, a wide receiver fits my build. It's like, okay, I'm going to take Allen Lazard or Christian Watson or whatever over, or I need a tight end. I'm going to take Robert Tonyan over a very similarly projected player at their position, and just doing all of that, like, leaning on week 17 kind of as my tiebreaker and kind of structure guider. Like, it just makes too much sense to me because it's really the only lever I can pull. And if I do it effectively over 150 teams, I'm not really giving up anything because, like I said, I'm not like foregoing projection. I'm not foregoing structure. I'm not doing any of that. All I'm doing is like breaking ties with having as many correlations as I can. Sometimes it's a bigger game stack, and sometimes it's like, just give me Trey Lance to George Kittle with like Hunter Renfrow and a bunch of secondary correlations, because then I can try to find, right? I just get that one thing goes right for me in week 17. Trey Lance throws 2 touchdowns to George Kittle, and I get that game stack, and I give me as many shots at finding Rashad Penny and Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? Give me as many shots of finding Jamar Chase and Darrell Williams, and those little combinations that fit. And it just reduces the amount of things that I have to get right by like such a substantial margin that I think it's really important.
Yeah, it's fun to do too. And to your point, you can do it without giving up the value. Like, I'm a value hound. I'm drafting greedy. I want the correlations, but I want them, after ADP. And I'd almost rather have a team. I had a team where I took Mahomes, just fell a lot, and I took Mahomes. And I got sniped on Sky Moore because I refused to take him like too early. I got sniped on MVS. I just refused to take him too early. Then I was like, am I going to take Chase Claypool or McCole Hardman? I'm like, I'm not fucking taking McCole Hardman over Chase Claypool. and I have this team it's a single stack basically with Justin Ross and Patrick Mahomes. But I'd rather have a couple of those teams with some teams that, are correlated plus really good value. And now we've got kind of, okay, good advance rate, but like also set up for week 17. And to your point, it doesn't have to be, mega onslaught of your main quarterback. I had another one I took, one that I just did last night. I took Lamar late. I love Lamar, at his ADP right now. I took him past ADP, wasn't able to stack him, but I got Chase Claypool like right at ADP. So it's a 1-1. And then like, I took Amon-Ra around after ADP. I took DJ Chark around after ADP. Let me grab Jared Goff and Velus Jones with my last 2 picks. I've got, and then that team just worked out as like Diggs, Gabriel Davis. I took Tyler Boyd, who I like really am not taking at ADP, but it was like, it's a good way to diversify your overall exposures too in a natural way. We're like, okay, here's a guy I'm really not drafting much, but it's at ADP. It's a wide receiver that fits my structure, and it's correlated. Like, now's the time to grab a little bit of that.
That's one of my favorite parts too, because we have people always have the other debate about, should you diversify or should you take a stand? And at the end of the day, that's kind of a bunch of nonsense, really, and it's up to each person. But doing that helped like breaking those ties, right? Like I'm not really taking Tyler Boyd either. I'm not really taking like the Patriots wide receivers, for an example. Like no one goes in like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make Kendrick Bourne my highest owned wide receiver. Like nobody's excited to draft Kendrick Bourne, but I don't know. I took Tyreek Hill. Maybe I have a Tyreek and Tua stack, and nothing has worked out for me yet. It's like there's all kinds of Patriots available. Who's to say that whatever? Wan'Dale Robinson is better than Kendrick Bourne. And I like him, but on the teams that it makes sense to take Kendrick Bourne, I'm going to take Kendrick Bourne. And on the teams that it makes sense to take Wan'Dale, I took JT, and I don't have a wide receiver. I need a wide receiver here. I'm just going to take Wan'Dale. And so I found it helps me with like getting take locked onto guys. And I do prefer to take a little bit of stands on players, but this is a way for me to like keep it in check, right? I don't particularly want 85% of anybody, and this is just like the easiest way for me to balance out the portfolio while also like still doing something else that helps, right? I'm not just diversifying to diversify, but I'm doing something else that is improving my teams.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the whole portfolio approach, which is personal preference. I think my edge is in a lot of the systemic stuff, so I like having diversified player exposures just because I'm kind of like, I don't want to ruin my edge by being overly exposed on a micro take that I'm wrong on. And there's nuances there. I'll still be, heavier on some players than others. Of course, there are other people who, the guy who won last year, Liam, was saying, if you're extremely heavy on one player and that player hits, now you've got a bunch of you're more likely to run into like a unique silver bullet because you've just advanced teams at such a high rate and you've got so many different combinations with this player. And it's kind of personal preference. It's the same thing I tell people in DFS that are MMEing for the week with 150. If you want to lock a player, there's nothing wrong with that. I actually in DFS, when I MME, it's usually, I don't MME often. It's usually when I have a strong take and I'm like literally building 150 lineups around that take, or I'm not MMEing, which is different than my, season long approach. So it's largely personal preference. I know it's hard for us to rank stuff now too. I don't know if you found this with Spike Week rankings, but it's hard for me because people are like, oh, I'm never getting Russ Wilson. And I'm like, well, you can still, if we like Judy and Sutton, it's just kind of the way that the points are distributed. If you like Russ, you can still take them correlated around ahead of ADP or, around ahead where we have them. But like, I almost feel compelled to have the rankings a little tired to ADP just because the people that are building 150 do kind of seem to like really want to be diversified.
It's like the hardest. It's like the hardest part. I hadn't put together like real serious and like been super serious about putting rankings and those kinds of things together until late last year. And then obviously this year. And it is like it's the hardest thing to do because like we got to this, we're halfway through this podcast or whatever. And we never really talked about, do you like this player better than this player, right? Because it's so low on the priority list in terms of how I'm drafting my teams. Obviously, you have a general, idea. Like you said, you're higher on Lamar than he is at his, market ADP. We all have that. But at the end of the day, same thing. Like, I don't know. I'm probably not higher than the market on Russ Wilson. So I wouldn't probably, like, I'm going to get more Trey Lance than I'm going to get Russ Wilson. Doesn't mean I don't want Broncos stacks. As a matter of fact, I want plenty of Broncos stacks. But I may not, on a top 250 or whatever, it may not look like I want to take the Broncos, but I actually do. And so, like you said, it's trying to balance sticking to ADP with kind of the general binary black and white. Do I like this player or this player better is the most difficult part. The one thing I was going to say, I think this is why the DFS thing is definitely why I lean a little bit more to stance. I'm not Liam. I'm not taking 80% of Gabe Davis or whatever. But I get that approach because that's exactly how I'm not an MME player, but if I do it, it's like there's one thing I feel passionately about this one thing, and I really don't give a shit about the rest. So I remember, I think we both, at being non-MME guys, typically MME the same week with the exact same plan, and it was Josh Allen and the Bills against the Jets.
The Jets.
Yeah, and I think
Oh, God.
it was like Crowder was out, and so it was like you basically had Denzel Mims, and Braxton Berrios, and like whatever. And this was before Michael Carter. This is 2 years ago, I think. So it was like
Mhm.
some Ty Johnson or some dusty running back that like all the Jets were
Frank
free. I
Gore,
think
baby.
Frank
No.
Gore. It was Frank Gore. You're right, and he got hurt, I think. And so it was like, I'm like, the Bills are going to score 100, and one of these guys have to get there. So like, I'm just going to play 150 Bill sticks. And I think the finishing score was like 19-3 or something like
Yeah, the
that. And
Bills
like
stunk. It was
they kicked like 4 field goals or something.
their worst game of the year. But
I
yeah,
cashed zero.
that,
I cashed 0 teams out of 150 in the Millie Maker.
and then that's sort of the thing too, is like, okay, my edge is on the stack. So then like I'm making sure I'm diversified on like maybe even the chalk, like other pieces,
Right.
because I want to win if I hit my stack. So this is
Yep.
that's what's kind of like, I want to win if I hit my structure. When I ask you about uniqueness, this comes up because that's the other aspect of DFS. You mentioned we don't know the ownership, but I've seen some stuff from Hayden. I was talking to Peter Overset that, based on where the ADPs line up on guys, there are players that are drafted together more frequently than other players. Again, I'm greedy. I'm a value hound. So I've been sort of against this. But like, at what point are you deviating from ADP to get a unique player combination? And does that change for you based on time of year? Because I know for me, I'm struggling with doing it right now because I know the ADPs are going to change so much. Whereas in August, when they're set, I feel like I'd be more apt to do it because it's just more teams are going to be drafted then. And it's like, it's very clear who's going to be lined up with who.
100%. Then that's like specific to Best Ball Mania, right? If you're drafting in the puppy right now, which is like you said earlier, might fill in a week, which is crazy. You can, and I like to experiment with that. That's the nice thing about this new crazy best ball space is we get these tournaments that drop right into a small pocket of time throughout the summer. So like the puppy is just going to be this late May, early June time pocket, and we'll look back probably, like you said, in August, September, when the ADP gets really efficient and there's really only so far anybody can move outside of an injury. And we'll look back at some of the stuff right now, like it was ridiculous. Somebody is going somewhere that is like 2 rounds off of where they'll be going later or more when we get an injury. And so to that point, I'm not doing much of it in Best Ball Mania and like the DraftKings tournaments because I couldn't agree more. I feel like I'm decent at understanding who's going to rise and who's going to fall and all that. I think that's a skill. If you do this for a living, hopefully you should be able to analyze it a little bit better, maybe than the average person. And so I think I have an idea, but I also want to be like humble about that. I could be wrong, and now I just forced what's not a unique, combination of players, and I didn't gain anything else from it.
Right.
And so I probably lost, like you said, projection. I take X player in a totally different tier to X player. Like, I don't know, if you have, you take CeeDee Lamb over Devontae Adams to try to get CD and AJ Brown or whatever, because you're not really going to get that combination. It's like if I have Devontae Adams in just a whole different tier than CeeDee Lamb, I'm hurting myself, and I don't know. CeeDee Lamb could get steamed up to the late first, and the next thing you know, that's not even really a unique combination. I do like to do it a little bit now, like basically in the 18th round. And so not from a player combination perspective, but just players that are not getting drafted right now, I think is the
Yeah.
best way to do it. And like ones that make sense on your team, right? So you mentioned earlier, who was it that you had to, backdoor stack of
I
some,
like
super gross.
Tylan Wallace is my
Yeah.
random Baltimore, because Baltimore can be hard to stack because it's literally Andrews and Bateman if you miss them.
Right. 49ers are actually fairly similar. So like Lance goes after every skill player. And so I don't want to have like sometimes maybe Lance will fall or whatever. And so I'll be like, I'm locked out of quarterback. He's very clearly a tier break for me personally. And I'm like, I just didn't get Debo or Kittle or Ayuk. Well, guess what? Danny Gray, welcome to the team in the 18th round. And he's not getting drafted all, in all these. So he inherently is going to have a lower ownership just because he's only going in 15% of these early drafts. So I think we can pull that lever a little bit at the end, but I'm not forcing it early in Best Ball Mania specifically, because I don't want to pretend like I know exactly all the combinations of ownership.
Yeah.
It's not DFS where, like, I don't know, I can accurately project within a standard deviation. I don't think I can do that here, so I'm not even gonna worry about it. I will, to your point though, later,
Yeah.
100%.
I
When
like doing it later.
75% of teams have been drafted, I think I'll have a pretty good idea of which combinations are unique. So it's a good thing for late.
Yeah, I like doing it later. I know Herzig said kind of the same thing as far as time of year. He's not doing it later now because he's, like the cut risk on someone like some of these guys is really high.
Yeah.
But then, come August, if they do win the job, they might not end up super unique. Like they might be drafted in round 16 to 18
Hmm.
consistently. And then it's like, to your point where it's like, okay, you took this huge risk when like these people drafting in August could just take that player in round 17 without the risk. And
Yep.
but I'm balancing that. I still am doing it once in a while. I've done the Danny Gray thing before. Okay, so as far as like last thing, just a little bit more micro stuff as far as this year, like perceived edges that you have right now, like whether it's like structure, player, positional things, like anything that you're seeing that you feel strongly about right now.
Well, I don't want to make this another Lucy with the football season of Trey Lance, but I would be remiss if I didn't bring him up for the second year in a row of us talking. But I really do believe that like his ADP is egregious, and we talked about the quarterback thing. It is so efficient, right? I agree. I like Lamar at his cost. I like Kyler at his cost, but we're talking like half a round, right? It's not
Yeah.
really that different. I think Trey Lance is priced like like just the wrong tier in terms of where he should be going. And we just don't get the opportunity to find that upside at his cost. Like it just really doesn't happen anymore. And so I am trying to take him. I do also think he's going to rise. Same thing as last year. People like it's just
Yeah.
the uncertainty thing right now, right? With Jimmy still being on the team. Once we get more and more information, once we see him practicing more, which he's already doing, he's only going to go up. He's not going to fall. So that's one. My big thing. I was curious about your take on this too, because as a noted running back hater, I have found myself taking some early running backs, but it's like this pocket at like the 2-3 turn.
Oh,
And
it's beautiful.
so it's unbelievable. Like I like that range, like better even than the early running backs, or at least like similar, right? Like Aaron Jones, Leonard Fournette, even like Nick Chubb. Who am I missing? Javante. I love Javante.
Kamara.
Kamara, Saquon. There's just like all these guys that I don't know. They could be first round picks. Why is Joe Mixon a round and a half better than Saquon Barkley?
Yeah.
And so there's those guys, which then in turn allow me to get the superstar wide receiver, or if you want Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews in the second or whatever. It allows me like just a ton of flexibility, knowing that pocket of the draft exists. So I've actually been drafting those guys like as anchor running backs, or if you want to go hyper fragile, I like kind of mix it up, take a Justin Jefferson and then hammer two of those running backs there, as opposed to people love to force their strategy out of the gate. And I like to kind of do the opposite, like let it flow and see what happens. If it turns into a 0 running back team, that's fine. If it turns into a hyper fragile team, that's fine. But thinking about those, like who's available in what round and all that kind of stuff, that pocket really stood out to me and has stood out to me, already for a month since the contest's been open.
Yeah, you absolutely have to be flexible, I think, to eke out the best value. Even though we're aware of structure, like we can, based on where our capital, it's just like constantly a teeter totter. Like you can play it that way. And your dog agrees with me clearly. But my favorite strategy is similar to what you said. So last year, running back, wide receiver starts worked really well. I kind of like this same start, but flipped. Wide receiver, running back. To your point, I don't know how long these running backs are going to last around 3. I don't think it's going to last all offseason. Like it's already started to stop a little bit. Like Aaron Jones, I was screaming is like the best buy out there, and now I'm looking at our rankings and we have like him behind ADP. like his ADP is 18 now. It was like late round 3 at one point. It's already switched so much. And same thing with Saquon to an extent. We're still ahead of ADP on him, but there's also God, I like J.K. Dobbins. I feel like I don't know if that much has changed from last year, and he's like 2-3 rounds cheaper. So if I can start, Jamar Chase and another strong wide receiver in round 2, and then get Saquon and Dobbins, I feel like I'm basically doing the structures that worked last year, except even better, because I think the wide receiver talent matters more than the running back talent. So it's like, to me, I feel like I'm netting even on the running backs that you drafted in 1 and 2 last year, and I'm just banking better wide receivers.
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. It's so strange, and I've been trying to kind of theorize on why that is, because I'm the same way. All that entire tier from, like you said, Aaron Jones has been like the one that's gotten steamed quite a. Damn dogs. They
Oh, good.
they always something, but there is that pocket where, like you said, in years past we had the running back dead zone thing, right? But if everyone believes that the running back dead zone is like a thing, and the market like changes the cost on guys that aren't necessarily running back dead zone actual, right? Saquon Barkley is not a dead zone running back. I'm sorry to
Right.
tell you, he's not. He was going like 102 2 or 3 years ago or whatever. Like this guy has caught almost 100 balls in a season, in his rookie season. This guy is not a dead zone running back. I mean, J.K. Dobbins probably isn't a dead zone running back. And so when they start to go in that dead zone and people still avoid them because of kind of what we talked about earlier, like the historical data on running backs in the 4th round, like you can't take them. Well, let me know when Saquon Barkley was ever available in the, in the late 3rd, 4th round or whatever. It's just crazy. And so those are some of the elements that I really want to take. Like there's tons of different pockets of drafts and understanding the nuances of all that. And that's really all I've been doing. I don't think I have like super rigid player takes specifically, probably other than Trey Lance so far, but learning all the different pockets of the draft, when can you stack the 49ers, right? How does a draft have to play out? What pick do I have to have? Do I need to take George Kittle at 4-8, or can I push him to 5-7 because sometimes he's falling, right? Understanding all of that different stuff just takes practice, but I think it's maybe like the most important thing. Like you can do all the player research and advance rate research and structural research all you want, but if you don't know like how to construct the team when you actually get into the draft, and you don't know your preference, like you said, like I would just rather start with Jamar Chase and AJ Brown and still
Yeah.
get superstar running backs, right? But if you don't know that and you just hop in and you're like, okay, give me Derrick Henry and give me Joe Mixon, like that. And I'm not saying those guys are wrong, but if you have the same belief that you do, you're probably good at structure, and you might even be good at player picks, but you don't understand the market that you're drafting in.
Yeah. Very last thing I want to ask about is, quarterback, and touched on it a little bit with Lance, but man, it seems like the elite quarterbacks now, they're elite in such a predictable fashion because the way offenses operate. You've either got teams like Tampa Bay and Kansas City that are going to score a ton, and they have such a high pass rate over expectation that the game script doesn't matter. They're going to be efficient, and those quarterbacks are going to be great. Or you have quarterbacks like Kyler and Lamar who are just going to do so much, rushing, passing, all of it, that like they're not going to, it's not like when Matt Ryan was QB2 overall because he happened to throw a little bit more and had a hugely efficient season. Like those things don't happen anymore. So there's there's just very few like like I like Tua this year, but Tua is not gonna have this outlier season that busts into the top 5 quarter. Like it
No.
almost physically can't happen. And then when I translate that to weekly scores and even think of the week 17 stuff, I'm like, if Lamar puts up 32, you could have 5 fucking mid-tier quarterbacks. You're not gonna, none of them are
No,
gonna get 32
they
because
can't.
they
As you said,
can't
it's a physical
get
limitation.
32. Yeah, it's a limit. So there's a caps. Whereas, like, I don't know, I could have 3 crappy wide receivers and one of them might score 26. So, like, to me, I've really been emphasizing the elite quarterback. And like some of me thinks like, okay, like probability wise, like those 3 crappy wide receivers probably aren't gonna match that one wide receiver. And maybe I'm getting hung up on like the 99th percentile outcome, which is the quarterback can't be matched and the wide receiver could.
Yeah.
But I find myself really like, with the exception of when I can get Lance late, like Lance is almost my backstop because
Mm-hmm.
I want at least one quarterback prior to that.
I'm very, very similar. And I think what it really kind of like emphasizes for me is not even just specifically with their quarterback. They're just the easiest ones to identify. But like other than the understanding, right? Understanding that those things, that Lance is your backstop, and understanding how to manipulate your draft. It's like, I think best ball, again, go to the rankings thing. It's hard to rank players because what I would classify every player as like an archetype. Like Trey Lance is an archetype of a quarterback, and that's what we're talking about here. Like, why can't Tua do what Lamar Jackson can do? Because his archetype physically does not have that. It does not exist, right? Theoretically, Lamar Jackson could score like 9 touchdowns in a game with multiple rushing and passing just because of the archetype that he is, right? So that's the ceiling, to your point. But so then grouping the other player archetypes together, and I think certain of those archetypes all mesh well together, right? So like understanding when I have that elite quarterback and I'm maybe foregoing Gabriel Davis or Jerry Jeudy or somebody like that, who definitely has a ceiling that does not exist in your 15th round wide receivers. But then, okay, what kind of, I don't want to take Devontae Parker then on that team, right? I want to take an archetype that does have that Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? And it could be that he may not be sexy, right? I don't know. Maybe you don't like Velus Jones or Danny Gray or whatever. People shat on Jahan Dotson. He was the first round rookie wide receiver that nobody wanted. But there's just those a contingent value running backs then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, so maybe instead of wide receiver, I was like, now I'm pretty weak at running back. Well, don't take James White, right? Because he just doesn't. Same thing. He's an archetype that just cannot do what Rashad Penny did. It doesn't matter. Nothing can happen to make James White be Rashad Penny of last year. Same thing. Devontae Parker can't be Amon-Ra St. Brown or Justin Jefferson from 2 years ago. So like knowing how to mix and match those archetypes, right? There can be a place for James White on teams. There can be a place for Devontae Parker on teams, but being able to mix and match the right stylistic players together is how you can effectively target elite quarterbacks and not lose out on that upside late in the year.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Thanks so much for joining me, Eric. Why don't you tell the people about what you got going on over at Spike Week?
Yeah, very, very excited. Up until now, everything has been like completely 100% free. You brought up the rankings. We have rankings for every single site. I do a top 250. People just like to have the overall ranking set, but I do positional tiers, which is something that has really helped me in some of the things that we talked about. So I don't even like really look at who I have 12th overall versus 15th overall. I'm looking at each position and making sure to put those players into tiers. I'm actually trying to work on adding some archetype type stuff to my rankings to help with some of the issues that we talked about here as well. And just tons and tons and tons of content. We're on YouTube every single weekday, and tons of strategy stuff coming out. And we're working on some tools, which I think everybody in the community, I've teased them a little bit on Twitter in terms of managing your exposures and all that different stuff. We're working on some tools, which I don't have a set. I was hoping, to have a set date that we're going to be launching that. I don't have a confirmed date, but it's coming very, very, very soon. So people should be able to test out some fun, new, hopefully innovative best ball tools here pretty shortly at spikeweek.com.
Awesome. Exciting stuff. If you're listening to this on the podcast on iTunes, make sure you give us a like, review us. Same thing if you're watching on the Established Run YouTube channel, subscribe. Helps us to keep doing podcasts like this for free. Thanks for tuning in. Best of luck in Best Ball Mania 3, everybody.